Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining this week's Chamber One-on-One. I'm excited to share that today's discussion is sponsored by our friends at Centerpoint Energy and our good friend Paul Locke, so thank you for your sponsorship. I'm honored to welcome State Representative Dr. Greg Bonnen. Dr. Bonnen represents Texas House District 24, which includes portions of Galveston County, including League City, Friendswood, Clear Lake Shores, Kemah, Dickinson, Santa Fe, Hitchcock, and several others. Representative Bonnen was born and raised in the Gulf Coast, graduated from Texas A&M University with a Bachelor's of Science degree majoring in biochemistry, then went to UTMB for his medical degree and 6 years of residency training in neurosurgery. After completing that training, he joined UTMB as a faculty full-time assistant professor, leaving in 2000 to found the Texas Brain and Spine Center. 2003, Representative Bonnen and his partners founded the Houston Physicians Hospital. He served as chairman of their board since 2006 and also serves on the board of directors of Third Coast Bank and is the chairman of the board of the Medical Strategic Network. Dr. Bonnen's been a leader in the state legislature and currently serves as the chairman of the very powerful House Appropriations Committee, tasked with determining how to spend the state's funds. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Bonnen.
Hi, good afternoon.
Great to see you, Dr. Bonnen, and thanks for being here. I know most folks on the line know you quite well and have met you in the community, but if you wouldn't mind starting off and sharing a little bit about your journey to the state legislature, where you're from, and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I grew up in Angleton, not too far away from here in southern Brazoria County, and I guess that was my world all the way through high school. I went to A&M, which was a very natural transition for me because my dad actually grew up in College Station. My grandfather taught at A&M for many, many years. And after 4 years at A&M, went to medical school in Galveston. And that in part was the choice of UTMB was influenced heavily by my future wife, who's an occupational therapist. And that was her choice for OT school. She loved the program and the people there. And so I decided, well, that would be a great place for me to go to medical school, and it was close to home. I didn't figure she'd want to go to Galveston. She's from the hill country, and I thought we'd end up in San Antonio or some other part of the state. So 12 years on the island doing medical school, and again had no idea I'd stay there to do my residency training, but that's how it turned out, and stayed on as faculty for another 2 years. And at that point, we had two little girls and decided to move up to the north part of the county and into Friendswood. And at the same time, I started my own practice. And about, I guess that would have been 2001-ish. And in 2012, that was when then Representative Taylor decided to run for the state Senate. And so that became a vacant or an open seat. And I had thought about running for the legislature in 1992, not running, but identified that would be something that someday I might be interested in doing. And the things that interested me about it was that I recognized even back then that you actually could continue to have your professional career, whatever that might be, and yet serve in Austin. And it's part-time in this sort of, in the sense that we're in regular session 5 months every other year. Of course, we actually do a lot of things both in Austin and at home year-round every year. So it's really a little more than a part-time job. But nonetheless, it does allow you to remain engaged full-time or at least part-time in your chosen profession while you're still actively serving. So that was 1992. But I had to go through my training and start a practice and get to a point in life professionally where it was reasonable to do that. And then the other big factor was I knew we'd be having children, and I was just concerned about the time commitment and what this would involve. So I figured when the girls, I didn't know we'd have girls, but it turns out we have daughters. When the kids were finishing high school would be an opportune time perhaps. And that's almost how it turned out. Sometimes timing is really important. And so the opportunity to run 20 years later came up, and the girls were not quite finished with high school, but close. And so I decided, well, it's still a hard choice, but if there was ever a moment where you were actually going to to follow through and attempt to do that, then that was the time. And so that was back in 2011, 2012, and then I started in 2013. So that's just it's a very brief overview.
Yeah, and a great journey, and we're happy to have you representing our community in Austin. And to that end, the legislature wrapped up a few weeks ago, and I think an interesting session to watch. I'd be curious to hear your perspective just on the session as a whole, and then maybe if you could talk a little bit about what some of your priorities were going into session and how they played out.
Yeah, so this was definitely a very different session. Now, I got to tell you, each session seems to have its own personality and its own themes. There certainly are things that are consistent, but they're never exactly the same. But this was clearly unique. And the pandemic, of course, was the big backdrop that generated so much of the change. And there were a couple of aspects to that. And one was that from a fiscal standpoint, if you think back to about a year ago, the economy was in recession, and there was deep concern about where we would be fiscally from a state. And the comptroller had projected last summer that we might have as much as a $4.5 billion shortfall in the current budget cycle. And there was speculation, not so much on the part of the comptroller, but just generally, that if you looked at the available revenues that we had in this 2-year budget cycle and what might we have in the next budget, it could be as much as $20 billion less to work with. So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concern going in. But then the second big issue, as everybody has experienced, was all of the precautions that were being taken. And back in January, we were still in the height of the second wave, if you will, of the pandemic. And so it really changed everything that we did on a daily basis. My office was still open the whole time, and we did have some people come in, but the volume of people was dramatically less in January and February than what we're accustomed to seeing. The amount of time that we spent on the floor of the House in January and February was a lot less. Now, we don't have legislation on the floor of the House other than some basic things such as our House rules and resolutions, things of this nature in those first weeks. But it actually is an important time because that is when members are talking with one another about things they would like to do during session, specific bills that they're working on, even though those bills are still in the committee process and not ready to come to the floor. It's also a time to build relationships with your colleagues. So a whole lot of that didn't happen the way that it normally would in January and February. And then, of course, we had this terrible, really severe winter storm, and that not only was an entire week that we did not get together in Austin, we were still able to work on the things personally that we were working on legislative, but we couldn't meet on the floor of the House for obvious reasons. We didn't have committee hearings that week. But it created a whole nother body of work, a whole nother policy area that rose to the top of the list of priorities that hadn't been anticipated prior to the storm happening. So then we got into March and things started to resume a little bit more normal level of activity. We started to spend a lot more time on the floor. Committees started to pick up with their hearings. And I would say by April and May, we were operating with some precautions in place, but really in terms of the hours and the volume of what we were doing, it felt pretty normal. And so we ended up, if you want to compare it, regular session over regular session, with an incredibly productive session. And I think we did by far much more than anybody on the outside looking in would have predicted. We had people projecting prior to session and in the early stages of session that we pass a budget and maybe a few other priorities, and that would be the end of it. But we actually had a great session, and we accomplished a tremendous amount by the time that it was all over. So that's just a general overview of kind of the gist of it. Priorities for me, obviously, being the chair of the Appropriations Committee is a huge responsibility and a huge honor at the same time. And your number one priority is the budget of the state of Texas. And that is a big, very time-consuming item. So that was the number one issue. We also did a lot of other fiscally related things in my office, including reforming or making some fundamental changes to the state pension that I'm happy to visit with you guys about. Senator Taylor and I worked together to change the governance structure of the permanent school fund, which is going to, without spending any more money as we go forward, because we'll allow them to function at the level that they should without having an unnatural cash position. It'll generate $150 million a year of additional funds for public education in the state on an annual basis in perpetuity. So there were a lot of fiscal matters that I worked on. And then, of course, you always have local issues and other regional items. We worked on TWIA and gave the coast greater representation when it comes to the rate setting process, and set up a process for us to take a close look at how rates are determined and how the funding structure for TWIA is structured. And that's something that's really important to our local economy. There's a couple $100 million for the coastal spine that's in the budget. Senator Taylor and Representative Paul did a great job of working on the Gulf Coast Protection District, which is another key element in demonstrating to the federal government that we not only need but are prepared to manage the responsibility of having that barrier system in place once it's built. So that was another important regional item that we were able to work on. So there's more. I think between House and Senate bills, I either authored or sponsored in the House, meaning I carried the bill, I think 23 different items that passed, but those are just some of the highlights.
Yeah, and I was excited to see they announced the names of the committee members that would be part of the Coastal Protection District. And I know Bob Mitchell was on there, and Mayor Bechtel, and a number of other familiar faces from this community. So nice to see that continuing to make progress. Very important for everybody that lives down here. So excited to see that. Just as one of the other things that I know was a big issue, you talked about the winter storm. And then most recently, we started getting alerts about the energy grids at the start of the summer as we kind of had this heat wave. Any thoughts on how it's going just with electricity reliability, not necessarily ERCOT, but at the infrastructure of the state and what's going on with that?
So specifically as it pertains to electricity, I do think that we were able to get a lot accomplished. Now, the changes that need to be made are not changes that can be made in a day or a week or even a month. And the other thing that we had to really focus on was not just extreme hot weather, which is what we're accustomed to managing, say, in the month of August and a little, before and after that. But the type of cold that we had experienced was something that is very atypical and very unusual for the state of Texas, and we learned a lot through that experience. So some of the things that need to be done are, first of all, weatherization, if you will, of the power production infrastructure. In addition to that, there were some plants generating electricity that actually lost their supply of natural gas, which forced them to go offline when they were otherwise still able to function. So identifying more accurately critical infrastructure, such as power generators, and making sure that they don't lose their supply of fuel is really important. We actually had natural gas wells that froze, so those need to be, at least the critical ones supplying things such as a power plant, must be more properly weatherized for extreme cold temperatures. Another thing that was a very reasonable and positive feedback was, hey, especially on the coast, you guys have tropical storms and hurricanes all the time, and you give people warning. You see it coming, there is an alert, you give advisories, and we give people advice on what to do. There was really not good communication in advance of the storm. If anything, there was more of a false reassurance that everything was going to be okay when it wasn't. So there is a group that is set up to monitor and stay on top of what's happening with respect to the power grid in times of extreme weather, and to more effectively communicate to the public exactly what it is that's taking place. We're still going to, and of course, from a governance standpoint, the PUC and ERCOT have both undergone very substantial change. So we still have work to do. By no means is that complete, but there was a tremendous amount that has been done. And with respect to the recommendation to conserve earlier this summer, a lot seems to have been said about that, but I do think that that's not unusual. When we have hot temperatures, which we do every summer, the advice that you be mindful and respectful of your use of energy is pretty common. It's common sense and it's standard. So I don't think it was an indication that we were close to some type of a breaking point, but it was very reasonable and actually not unprecedented to say we're experiencing a lot of demand at this time, and when we compare that to our available resources, we need people to conserve when they can, and that's what happened.
For that explanation of how that all works, and appreciate the work on that at the legislature this year. I know the next big thing that's coming up, the governor announced a couple of days ago that July 8th would be the at least the first special session, TBD about other special sessions. Can you talk a little bit about your expectations for what's going to be in this special session, how that process works, and just a little bit about what to expect coming up?
Sure. So the governor is the only person who can call a special session. And in addition to that, the governor determines what topics are going to be on the agenda. We refer to that as the call. And each special session only lasts 30 days. So at the end of 30 days, it's automatically over. Now, if we haven't accomplished everything that needs to be accomplished at the end of 30 days, the governor may call another special session as soon as the very next day, but we would then begin the process over again. So what's happened is that we had some unfinished business, and specifically as it pertains to election integrity. And the governor has called a special session to start 2 weeks from today, which is July the 8th, I believe. And he hasn't officially said what will be on the agenda, but we do know that that it has been said that, yes, election integrity, bail reform, I think taking a look at social media, there are a number of items that may very well surface, but ultimately it'll be up to the governor to decide what to list on the call or as an agenda item. Then we have 30 days to address those topics, and if we are able to complete what we set out to do at the end of those 30 days, that would be the end. And I would anticipate we would not be called back to revisit those topics. However, we also know that there will be at least one additional special session, and that will be on redistricting. Typically, so every 10 years we do the census, and every 10 years the legislature then, based on the updated census information, will draw the maps, the geographic areas for the Texas House of Representatives, for the Texas Senate, and for our United States congressmen from the state of Texas. However, we did not have and still don't have the final census data from the federal government. So not having the census data, you can't draw the maps. So for that reason, we're not even able to take that up during the regular session. It's my understanding that we're going to get the final census data, we think, August the 15th or 16th, sometime mid-August. There have been requests from numerous states to push that up forward so that we can have as little further delay as is possible. But nonetheless, until we get the actual final census data from the federal government, we're not able to take up redistricting. So for that reason, we know we will be called back in at some point in the next 2-3 months, whenever it might be, to take up redistricting once we have the data we need to work on that issue. And there's one other thing I would add, and that is there's about $16 billion in American Rescue Plan Act funding for the state of Texas. There actually is more money that has been sent directly to large cities and counties and to institutions of higher education, and also money that funneled through the state directly to our public schools, but there's about $16 billion over which the state has some reasonable discretion, and we're awaiting more guidance or clarity on the rules around the use of those funds. And then I would expect that we would also take that up, not on July the 8th, but perhaps in the special session when we take up redistricting. The ARPA, or American Rescue Plan Act, was passed in March. And so it really, with our regular session ending at the end of May, it was just a matter of weeks, which, to be fair, you wouldn't typically get rulemaking and guidance from the federal government in a matter of weeks after such a comprehensive piece of legislation was passed. So as we wait to get answers to the questions that all of the states have around the allowable use of these funds, we have to wait to make that appropriation. But I think that's the other big item that you'll see taken up when we have not this first special session, but a subsequent special session in the fall.
Yeah, thanks for that. And as it relates to those funds, if you had, if we don't get specific direction, or if we're granted quite a bit of leeway as a state to do with those as we see the best fit use of those funds, do you have any personal opinions on where those resources should be allocated?
Certainly, I've given it some thought, and I think a lot of other people have as well. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Nobody has really put forth a definitive proposal on how to break down the use of those funds. And frankly, it really does matter what instructions we receive from the federal government as to how we're allowed to use them. So, for example, we've been told fairly clearly they're not allowed to be used for any type of direct tax relief. That's one issue where it would be nice if that were not the case, but if that's really off the table, then you can eliminate a whole category, if you will. So I do think there are a number of items that are likely to be considered. The state's unemployment insurance trust is likely to be a big topic when we consider the allocation of those funds. I think infrastructure at our higher education institutions is something that has a reasonably good chance of receiving a lot of focus when we're working on that. But from my perspective, the big thing is that what we want to do is use these dollars in a way that provides a really meaningful, productive return on investment for the people of the state of Texas for many years to come. And that's the big picture, the lens through which I look at evaluating any type of a recommendation for how we would spend that money.
Thank you for that. Going back to redistricting briefly, I think probably all our members are aware that we're expecting to get 2 new congressional seats in the state of Texas. Have you heard any rumors based on the kind of population growth in some of the big urban populations? Any predictions on where those 2 seats are likely to go?
Well, there are always rumors, and I wouldn't make any predictions, certainly not as it pertains to redistricting. So just as an observation, not as a rumor or a prediction, the state has grown, and that's why we've not just grown, but we have grown more than other states or regions of the country. And that's why our allocation of congressmen is going to increase, and it is going to increase by 2 congressional seats. So that means when we draw the maps for our congressional representatives, our representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, we'll have an additional 2 above and beyond what we have today. So how that works out within the map of the state is the question you're asking. And I think it's pretty clear that the Houston area and the Dallas area are not only the largest metropolitan areas in the state, but they have also both grown dramatically. And there's a pretty decent chance that the additional districts could be worked into those 2 geographic regions, but I don't know that definitively. So that's just an observation on my point, not a prediction or a rumor, but it seems that would be a reasonable chance.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to note that until the census data is out, it's all just speculation on what that looks like. And so that's really the driver of how that process begins, and then the data that feeds into that process. The other question I had related to special session for you, Dr. Bonnen, was one of the things that was interesting, I think unusual, although please correct me if that's wrong, was that the governor either threatened or did do a line item veto of the state legislature's portion of the budget. I expect will be a topic in special session. Can you talk about kind of what that means? And is that something that as long as y'all address the priorities that are laid out for special session, it just becomes another item? How does that all work? And can you share a little bit about that, what's going on there?
Sure. So within the article, it's structured into different components, or within the budget, it's structured into different articles or components. So we call a component an article. And the governor vetoed one specific section, which is Article 10. And what falls within Article 10 is the budget for the legislature and a few legislative-related state agencies. So the fiscal year for the state begins on September the 1st. We're still operating at the end of the current fiscal year. What was vetoed was that section of the budget beginning in the next fiscal year. So should we go back into regular session and pass an appropriations bill that restores this funding that was vetoed, then essentially it would be seamless. There would be no change. And I think that's what we're hoping to do, is to accomplish the work that was left unfinished and then restore the funding in Article 10 and move forward without any type of disruption.
Great. Thank you for explaining that process and what's kind of expected to happen. We only have a couple of minutes left. So my final question to you is, if you could take a minute and just talk a little bit about why the state's business is so important to the members of the Clear Lake Area Chamber of Commerce.
That's a great question. And it's, I think, a common observation that people are so focused on what happens in Washington, which of course is very important, that they forget we even have a state government. And yet the actions of the state from a fiscal standpoint, from a policy standpoint, they impact our everyday lives. And so that's why it's really important. And I had a very personal encounter with that as a medical student when the legislature decided to put a required rural primary care rotation into the third year medical school, beginning the first time or the first year with me becoming a third year med student. And that was just a few weeks after I had gotten married. And I wasn't particularly thrilled about that. As you might imagine, not that it wasn't a good idea to have medical students experience rural primary care. I was much more interested in staying in Galveston with my new bride. But it's just an example of how we make policy decisions that may be the right decision, and they're well intended, but they have real world consequences for individuals. And that's something that I try to keep in mind. And it's also a reason why you should always advocate for those things that are important to our community and into our region. And finally, I would point out the best pieces of legislation that I've gotten to work on, the things that have been most rewarding, have been things that came to me from constituents, from the people that I represent, who've said, hey, here's a life experience that I've had, here's a problem I've identified or a concern that is really important, and could you please do something about it? And that's the most rewarding work that we get to do. So that's why you should be engaged and involved with what happens in state government.
Absolutely. Well said, and thank you for that. Dr. Bonnen, I appreciate your time. If I can pay you a compliment, it's that a great leader has a great staff and a great team. And so I'd like to compliment them who helped us coordinate this, in particular Faye Picard, but all your team in Austin who've been fantastic to work with this legislative session, responsive and active and really great. But I appreciate your time and thank you so much for joining us today. We'd like to thank everybody online for joining us and taking the time to visit with Dr. Bonnen for a few minutes. A special thanks to our friends at CenterPoint Energy for sponsoring today's discussion. And also want to highlight a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m., we have the Coffee Break Catch-Up sponsored by Cottrell Realty. Next Wednesday, we have the General Membership Luncheon at Lakewood Yacht Club. And then on July 15th, we have the State of the Precinct Luncheon. That's sold out in person, but virtual tickets are still available. Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and hope you have a great afternoon.